The fall of Afghanistan, how 20 years of war ended in 11 days. How does a 20-year war costing trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and 2 decades of promises end in just 11 days? Why did a superpower spend 20 years fighting the Taliban only to hand Afghanistan back to them on what looked like a silver platter? This is not just about military strategy or politics. This is about betrayal, broken promises, and billions of dollars worth of U.S. weapons suddenly paraded through the streets by the very fighters they were meant to defeat. It's about women who once dreamed of universities, now staring at shuttered classrooms. It's about Taliban commanders dialing up local officials like they were ordering takeout, surrender today or else. And it's about one haunting question: what went so wrong, and who's really to blame? Stick around, because if you thought Afghanistan's fall was simple, you haven't heard how midnight airfield evacuations, bureaucratic bungles, and even frozen bank accounts shaped one of the most shocking collapses in modern history. For 20 long years, Afghanistan had been the center of America's longest war. What began in 2001 as a decisive mission to oust the Taliban after 9/11 slowly transformed into a war of attrition. By the time the end came in 2021, the Taliban, the very enemy driven out at the war's beginning, were sweeping back into power. On paper, Afghanistan's national defense forces boasted 300,000 troops, but in reality, corruption and ghost soldiers made the number far lower. Many men were unpaid, underfed, or entirely fictitious. Aid and money flowed in, $2.26 trillion spent by the United States over 2 decades. But much of it was siphoned off into private pockets. Even President Ashraf Ghani and his circle, according to later accounts, fled the country with bags of cash, leaving their people abandoned. The war had already taken its toll before the final unraveling. 47,000 Afghan civilians killed, 2,325 American service members dead, and over 20,000 wounded. 66,000 Afghan soldiers and police officers killed in action. Each number told the story of sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters lost in a war that seemed to stretch endlessly with no clear resolution. In 2020, the Trump administration struck a deal with the Taliban. All U.S. troops would be gone by May 1, 2021. By January 2021, only 2,500 U.S. troops remained, their numbers too small to hold the line. The U.S. and NATO promised to keep funding Afghan forces, $4 billion a year until 2024, but without the lifeline of U.S. air support, logistics, and medical evacuation, the Afghan army was crippled. The Taliban understood this better than anyone. They knew patience would deliver them victory. It started quietly but spread like wildfire. Local Taliban commanders made phone calls to mayors, police chiefs, and provincial leaders. The message was simple: why fight? Surrender, and we will spare you. Villages and towns fell with barely a shot fired. Provinces like Herat and Kandahar, once fortified bastions, crumbled under siege as government forces, starved of supplies and demoralized, laid down their arms. It looked like a blitzkrieg, yet it wasn't just military force. It was negotiation, intimidation, and inevitability. By mid-July, the United States signaled the real turning point: the midnight evacuation of Bagram Airfield on July 5, 2021. Afghan officials weren't even notified. Without U.S. logistical backbone, the Afghan forces were like an army without blood in its veins. By August 14, 2021, only 2 major cities remained under government control: Jalalabad and Kabul. Jalalabad fell on the 15th without resistance. Kabul stood alone, a city waiting for its fate. President Ghani fled the capital, abandoning his people. By evening, Taliban fighters walked into Kabul almost unopposed. Within hours, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was no more. With the Taliban in the presidential palace, tens of thousands of Afghans who had aided U.S. and coalition forces raced to the only possible exit: Hamid Karzai International Airport. Crowds overwhelmed passport offices, visa agencies, and embassies. The desperate pressed against barbed wire, begging U.S. Marines to let them through. Mothers lifted their infants to strangers on the other side of the fence, hoping at least their children might escape. On August 26th, tragedy struck. A suicide bomber attacked the crowds at the airport gates. The blast killed 13 American service members and dozens of Afghan civilians. They were heroes, serving in the most dangerous mission of all, saving others at the risk of their own lives. Now pause for a sec. Step into the extraordinary. Subscribe to Eccentric Digital Pixel. Welcome to the wild frontier of creativity, where pixels pulse with imagination and every frame tells a story you've never seen before. At Eccentric Digital Pixel, we don't follow trends, we bend reality. From surreal digital art to mind-blowing visual experiments, this is your backstage pass to the future of expression. Why hit subscribe? Get exclusive access to jaw-dropping digital creations. Be the first to witness new drops by turning on notifications. Dive into a world of eccentric brilliance that inspires, challenges, and captivates. Join a community of visionaries who crave the unconventional. Don't just scroll. Experience the pixel revolution. Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell to never miss a masterpiece. Because normal is boring, and you were born to see the world differently. As Kabul fell in August 2021, Hamid Karzai International Airport became the last tenuous lifeline out of the country. Tens of thousands of Afghans, interpreters, aid workers, soldiers, journalists, mothers with children, pressed toward the gates, desperate to escape Taliban retribution. But the Taliban, flush with victory, quickly cut off access for ordinary Afghan citizens. Armed checkpoints sprang up along the road to the airport. Taliban guards beat back families with rifle butts, waving through only those with foreign passports or high-level connections. The crowd outside the Abbey Gate, one of the airport's key entrances, swelled into a chaotic mass of fear and pleading voices. It was there, in the sea of desperation, that tragedy struck. On August 26th, a group of ISIS-K militants slipped through the crowd. A suicide bomber detonated himself in the press of civilians, and gunmen opened fire on both Afghans and U.S. Marines struggling to hold the gate. The blast and ensuing gunfire killed 13 American service members and dozens of Afghans, wounding many more. It was the most deadly day for U.S. forces in Afghanistan in a decade, and it made brutally clear that lingering beyond the August 31 withdrawal deadline was untenable. As planes roared skyward with fleeing diplomats, soldiers, and a fraction of Afghan allies, a fierce debate ignited back in Washington. How many Afghan refugees should be admitted? Should they be admitted at all? Thousands were already waiting in limbo, stuck in processing purgatory as they prayed for U.S. visas. This wasn't a new problem. Under the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, an architect of some of the harshest immigration policies, had successfully slowed and undermined refugee and visa programs. Even those Afghans who had risked their lives for American soldiers found themselves blocked by layers of bureaucracy. The problem was larger than one administration. Consular affairs at the State Department had been chronically underfunded and understaffed for years. When the crisis came, they simply lacked the manpower to process the flood of applications. Add to that a cultural problem within the State Department itself, a cautious, rule-bound bureaucracy that moved at a glacial pace, and the result was paralysis at the worst possible moment. It was the perfect storm. Underfunded systems, political sabotage, and a crisis that demanded speed when the machinery of government was built for delay. As the Afghan government crumbled, the Taliban seized not only cities but also the enormous arsenal left behind. Over $83 billion had been spent by the U.S. over 2 decades to arm Afghan security forces. Now much of it belonged to the Taliban. Armored vehicles rumbled through Kabul with white Taliban flags fluttering from their antennas. Soldiers posed with American rifles and night vision gear, propaganda meant to broadcast their triumph. Even aircraft, Black Hawks, helicopters, and drones were captured, though many were later deemed inoperable. This wasn't entirely new. For years, abandoned equipment had fallen into Taliban hands. But the scale in 2021 was staggering. An insurgency suddenly looked like a modern army, equipped with the very tools once meant to defeat them. For Afghan women, the Taliban's return was a nightmare revisited. In the 1990s, under Taliban rule, women were stripped of education, confined to their homes, beaten or killed for defying Sharia law as brutally enforced by the regime. This time, Taliban spokesmen promised a gentler rule. They appeared on social media, polished and diplomatic, insisting that women would have rights within Islamic law. The tone was carefully crafted for an international audience. The Taliban had learned to wield Twitter and television as weapons of legitimacy. Yet in Kabul, Fear told a different story. Women hid certificates of education, deleted contacts from their phones, and quietly burned documents linking them to Western aid groups. Parents whispered to daughters, "Don't draw attention, don't be seen." The question loomed heavy. Had 20 years of progress for women and girls been erased in an instant? Victory brought the Taliban power, but power required money. For years, they had financed their insurgency through illicit markets, opium smuggling, extortion, and tax collection in rural areas. That was enough to fund fighters, but now they faced the impossible task of running a country. When Kabul fell, the Afghan state coffers inside the country held only a fraction of the reserves needed. Billions in foreign currency reserves sat frozen in U.S. banks. The new Taliban rulers found themselves with guns and flags, but little cash. And unlike in the West, where citizens expect their wages promptly at midnight on payday, in Afghanistan, a salary might arrive weeks late, or half of it might vanish in transit. Families lived hand to mouth, waiting desperately for food money that trickled in uncertainly. Now the question was stark. Did the Taliban have enough to keep the country fed for even the next 90 days? The image of August 2021 is frozen in the world's memory. Afghans clinging to the wings of departing planes, Marines carrying infants over barbed wire, women weeping outside shuttered schools. The Taliban promised order and amnesty, but fear remained. The U.S. promised resettlement, but bureaucracy and politics stalled lives. Billions in weapons and dollars had changed hands, yet ordinary Afghans wondered if they would even eat next week. The Taliban offered amnesty and promised Afghans they could remain safely in their homes. But reports quickly emerged of reprisals, house-to-house searches, executions, and intimidation. Those who had trusted in the promises felt betrayed once again. The sense of abandonment and betrayal wasn't only in Afghanistan, it was global. To many, it looked as if after 2 decades of sacrifice, Afghanistan was simply handed back to the Taliban on a silver platter. The painful reality was that there had been no real stalemate since 2012. The government was steadily losing ground, week by week, year by year. Afghanistan's vast rural population, where the Taliban drew its strength, was beyond the central government's control. To hold the country would have required not fewer troops, but many more. Instead, the U.S. chose to leave. And with that choice, the Afghan government unraveled almost overnight. The fall of Afghanistan wasn't just a military collapse, it was a human one. It was the perfect storm of betrayal, bureaucracy, and brutality, leaving a nation adrift between the ghosts of its past and the shadows of its future. Don't forget to follow us, subscribe, and click that notification bell so you never miss another gripping story as we uncover the hidden truths, betrayals, and jaw-dropping